Hello and welcome to my slot on mental health discrimination. I'm Bhayani. I'm an employment solicitor and a partner at Bhayani HR and Employment Law. We're based in Sheffield and we're a niche practice. We come across clients of all different industry sectors and sizes. And I have to say that a common thread at the moment is dealing with those tricky stress-related and mental health issues within a workforce. One of our industry sectors that we specialise in is the hospitality sector, and particularly in that sector where you've got a transient and a young workforce, it's becoming very difficult for employers to know how to manage some of the issues. So I'm hoping that some of the guidance that I can give you today will help you to put in place an anti-discrimination culture which will protect your business as well as looking after the employees within the business. So supporting employees with mental health issues is one of the hardest things that managers have to deal with. When they've got employees who are suffering with a mental health condition, sometimes managers find it very hard to talk about those issues, and the individual finds it very difficult to open up to the employer due to worries about their job security and the stigma that's attached to mental health conditions. I think the key thing for a manager or of an organisation or HR manager is trying to remove that stigma and encourage people to be more open. So having lines of communication, accepting that mental health, poor or good mental health, is something we all have, and there are ways in which a business will help an employee to deal with them. Potentially getting an organisation like Mind to come in and do some work in your workplace, training your workforce on some of the signs to look out for and how some of those issues can be helped, I think is a really good idea, and there's a wealth of information on websites like Mind. A lot of people are taking up the mental health first aid training now, which is a 2-day accredited course, in the same way as lots of businesses, well, all businesses have to have a first aider. There'll also be a requirement in the future to have a mental health first aider. I think people are very quick to say that somebody has a performance issue or a behavioural issue without perhaps understanding that sometimes it's a condition that they have that's exacerbating or potentially causing that issue. So being mindful of that is important. I think we should, when we're talking about discrimination, we should have a look at what constitutes discrimination in employment law. So Part 5 of the Equality Act, you may be aware, protects a wide range of individuals. And it's important to note that it doesn't just protect employees, it protects job applicants, it protects those people who are in employment under a contract of employment, but also apprentices or anybody engaged within your business to personally carry out work. So workers are protected by discrimination laws. So, it includes employee shareholders and some categories of self-employed people, provided they are in employment and their contract obliges them to perform work personally. So it's actually a very, very wide net in terms of the business and the need to understand what discrimination law says. So if one employee discriminates against another or harasses another, then the employer will be liable. The only way that the employer can get out of that liability is to show that they've taken preventative measures. Some of those preventative measures will be some of the things that you've heard about earlier today, and some other ones are things like mental health training, risk assessments, putting in place reasonable adjustments, which I'll talk about shortly, good practice on dealing with complaints and grievances in a consistent and fair and objective manner, and keeping a paper trail on all these sorts of things is essential. Of course, a lot of that is done electronically with HR software these days. But it's really important to keep a record of where you are in discussions with your employees. And then if we just have a look at the definition of disability, let's remind ourselves that not all mental health issues constitute a disability, of course. Well, not for the purposes of the Equality Act. So I'll just remind you of the all-important statutory definition, which is that a person has a disability if he or she has a mental or physical impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on his or her ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And it's always a good idea, I think, if you're concerned at all about whether an individual in your organisation has a disability, revisit the definition, because if you have your mind on the definition and you put together all the circumstances surrounding an individual that you're dealing with, you can identify, hopefully, whether that person has a disability. You may recall that under the old Disability Discrimination Act, for a mental impairment to be classed as a disability, it had to be what was called clinically well recognised. So you'd get a medical report, you'd get a diagnosis that this was a clinically well recognised disorder or illness, and that would help you decide whether that's a disability. We've really shifted away from that now, and actually as part of the new rules under the Equality Act, you have a much wider approach, and you need to know as much as you can about an individual in your business who has a mental health condition. So things like your return to work interviews, absence review processes, GP and occupational health reports, they are all a fact find so that you can ascertain whether the key thing, which is this person able to do their normal day-to-day activities, which is where the focus is these days. I'd say that the most important thing of all is consulting with the employee and finding out what the employee's views are on how long-term the issue is and how much it affects that individual on a day-to-day basis. So there's a duty to make reasonable adjustments, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. The duty is only to make reasonable adjustments where an individual is suffering with a disability. Where the duty arises, the employer has to treat the disabled person effectively more favourably so that you remove the disadvantage. That's what reasonable adjustments are all about. And first of all, just to note that reasonable adjustments only applies where the employer knows or should know that the employee has a disability. We get calls all the time from our clients asking us for advice on whether a person suffering with stress in their workplace has a disability, and therefore do we have to put in place reasonable adjustments. Well, I would say that it's good practice to put in place some adjustments for anybody that's struggling to fulfil their role, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. But in terms of potential tribunal discrimination claims, the tribunals will want to look at whether an employer ought to know, not just whether they actually know that somebody is suffering with a disability. So you've got to take into account the whole circumstances surrounding that person. And it's not good enough to say that the disability was not known to us because the employee had never declared that they had a disability. A sort of whole view will be taken as to whether how that employee was manifesting symptoms, behaving in the workplace, whether their behaviour had changed over a period of time, whether really it should have been fairly obvious to a reasonable employer that that individual had a disability. There's no onus on a disabled person to suggest adjustments. This is another question we get asked regularly. well, the employee hasn't suggested any adjustments, but actually what the law says is that the duty to make reasonable adjustments is on the employer. And there's a leading case on this called Cosgrove and Caesar and Howie in 2001, where the EAC held that it was principally for the employer to come up with the reasonable adjustments, not for the employee to suggest them. However, it's of course good practice to consult with your employee and have a two-way dialogue about what reasonable adjustments might be feasible. And the individual who is undertaking the job on a daily basis will perhaps have more knowledge about the kind of reasonable adjustments they can put in place. So consulting with them and making sure that they're workable is really important. And remember the paper trail. So always keeping a record of what adjustments you've put in place, when you've put them in place, and perhaps reviewing in a short period of time whether those adjustments are making the kind of impact that you want to remove the disadvantage for the employee. Common adjustments for staff suffering with mental ill health are set out quite nicely in an ACAS document, which you can access from the ACAS website. ACAS provides a really useful sort of list of adjustments, which I'll go through some of those, which I've prepared here. So, first of all, allowing more breaks. So, allowing breaks to take place when needed. So, this is about adjusting the way that somebody's working. So, allowing breaks to take place when needed rather than a predetermined schedule. Changing the working day to start earlier or finish later. Allowing them to use paid or unpaid leave for appointments related to mental health. Offering a phased return to work, and allowing part-time working either on a temporary basis or a permanent basis if that's what the individual wants. And then perhaps looking at adjustments to the roles and responsibilities. You can review somebody's workload. Sometimes mental health issues mean that somebody just can't carry the workload they had, or indeed that their symptoms are exacerbated because they've got an unrealistic workload. So it's a good opportunity to revisit that and make sure that the employee is able to realistically do what you're asking them to do. Reassign duties that they're struggling with amongst other members of the team is something you could look at doing. Discussing vacant positions in the organisation, particularly if it's a larger employer, and temporarily transferring them to a different role if they want to do that might be considered to be good, reasonable adjustments related to the role and responsibilities. And then looking at adjustments to the working environment. We deal with quite a few businesses that are in the tech sector, for example, and we're coming across more and more individuals who are on the autistic spectrum and other mental health conditions whereby their working environment, rather than the actual work that they're doing, is a real factor in enabling them to do the job better. And there are some really simple things you can do. So providing partitions, room dividers to enhance soundproofing, less distraction is something that you can do, or even visual barriers can for some people really help them carry out their work. Offering a reserved parking space to make it easier for them to get into work, possibly. Offering home working for some of the week. A lot of work that lots of businesses do now can be done remotely, and being a bit creative about how you enable an employee to work remotely, work from home, can really transform the workforce. Increasing the size of their personal working space. Some people with mental health issues find it really difficult to be hemmed into a small area. Positioning them as far away from noisy machinery as possible, and providing a private space for them to use when they need privacy. I think that's a really key one. Perhaps just making it clear to the workforce that there is somewhere else that they can go whenever they feel that they need to go and perhaps have a break from the job at hand. where it's practical within your business. And then some adjustments relating to policy changes. So sometimes it is necessary to make adjustments to things like your grievance and disciplinary procedures, your sickness absence, certainly your sickness absence triggers, things like extending paid or unpaid leave during hospitalisation. That might not fit in with your current policy, but you might have to change that policy to aid an individual as part of a reasonable adjustment that you're making. Performance issues are really tricky for lots of people when they're dealing with an individual, and there's a blurred line between whether that individual is just not performing in the role or whether that performance is impaired by the illness, in this case a mental health illness. And so I think you've got to allow additional time for them to reach potential milestones which you might not otherwise do as part of your normal policy. So really opening up your whole attitude and policies relating to dealing with employees, you do need to consider when it comes to individuals with mental health issues. Some other ways of providing additional support and assistance, assigning a mentor or buddy to support them and help them could be one. Arranging a regular one-to-one with a manager to discuss and prioritise tasks. Providing a laptop for them to work at home when they don't feel able to attend the workplace, and offering additional training on the skills and duties that their job requires is something else that you can consider. To summarise then, some practical ways to demonstrate an anti-discrimination culture. It's not just about doing things that provide an anti-discrimination culture, but I think you have to also demonstrate that. Certainly from a legal perspective, if you ended up in a tribunal as a business, or if an employee made a formal complaint, you do need to be able to show that you've done things as an organisation that provides a really good anti-discrimination culture. So having a mental health and wellbeing policy is really, really important. Looking at that, not just sort of ticking a box, but looking at how that works for your organisation. Appointing mental health first aiders, as I've mentioned. Carrying out stress risk audits. The Health and Safety Executive have a really good audit checklist that you can use within your own business. Putting in place reasonable adjustments, as we've looked at in some detail. Offering flexible working. A lot of companies now are offering flexible working across the board, not just to those people that have any responsibilities for caring for others, but also, and not just for those that ask for it, but offering it. And actually it makes a huge difference to the way in which people can engage during the time that they're actually in work. Training your workforce on mental health issues. Mental Health England offer an accredited mental health first aid course along with Mind, which is really well worth investing in, and perhaps offering a counselling and support service for employees. So if you do all this and you still have employees that have performance or absence issues that you need to deal with and you need to tackle them formally, I think having a better foundation will enable you to have those difficult conversations and formal processes against a backdrop of a really responsible and positive culture towards mental health in your workplace. So all of that, I hope, goes some way towards helping you understand some of the things that you can put in place, both from a looking after your employees' point of view, but also it is important to acknowledge that as a business we have duties under law which mean that we have to protect the business as well by putting in place some of these initiatives.